Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined, as always, or as I always will be, by Dan.
Hello.
And Darren.
Hello.
So, some of you might remember us from our previous podcast, the Metaphoric Music Review, rest in peace, where we reviewed new music recommended by Pitchfork, probably the defining music publication of the last 20 years. Sometime around last summer, though, I think we all got pretty fatigued with following Pitchfork, and that led us to start this new podcast, where we get to talk about whatever we want. But it also gave us the inspiration for our first discussion topic today: what ruined Pitchfork? So, why did we get so fatigued? Why, after like 2.5 years or something of following Pitchfork religiously, did we lose the faith?
And not only 2.5, that was 2.5 years of like doing the podcast and following it. We've really been following it our, whole teenage to adult lives. But I think just the like inundation of really bad records was what did it for me. What about you, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, for the better part of a decade, right? I mean, this has been the place, the source that we would turn to for new music. And we ended up doing something that kind of forced us to visit it even more so than we probably ever did. And unfortunately, the content, the music just wasn't there. Like I don't know about you guys, but it sort of became a bit of a chore to listen to music that just wasn't as interesting as I had hoped for,
I was just going to say exactly that it became a chore. I was like dreading, having to listen to some of the things. And sometimes, you could just tell from the cover art immediately that it was going to be like a nightmare of a week where I had to like get really in depth with this record that was going to be terrible. So we're going to try throughout the course of this conversation kind of interrogate that. But I think we should actually start with, like, do we all agree that Pitchfork is, quote, ruined? I mean, that's like kind of a, hot takey, like clickbaity title intentionally, but is it ruined? Are there any merit left?
I mean, it is a clickbaity title, and we're sort of joking. I don't think it's like ruined. I still check it. It's a great place for news, for your regular indie and pop artists and stuff. And I'll still look at the reviews here and there, but it's more of it's just lost a bit of its grandeur, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll get into it a little bit deeper here in a few minutes, but it's really about kind of just losing faith a little bit. Like, I used to turn to Pitchfork and the whatever album, or maybe I hadn't checked in a while, so I'll check a couple of the last best new albums. I was just like counting on it. Like, I mean, it's one of these albums. Most of them are going to be good, at least worth listening to. Mm-hmm. And that sort of like changed into like, I don't know if this best new music label really means anything, because maybe this won't even end up on an end of the year list. Ooh, you know what I mean? Like,
right. Yeah. No, I completely agree, because I will get into this, but Pitchfork became so central, to my like music life, my young music life, that I had a hard time like believing that something was good if they gave it a bad score. I had this stink on it where I'd be like, I really like this record, but Pitchfork gave it like a 6.5. I mean, am I wrong? And like it was so in my brain that now I feel like I don't have that same trust. So it used to be like, oh, if it got a B&M and I don't like it, I must be mistaken. I should listen more. If it didn't get a B&M and I liked it, I must be mistaken. Now I've sort of lost the faith in that. And I think that's where we should sort of turn to, what made Pitchfork so good in the past. Hopefully we actually all agree on that. But, why was it so important to us? You mentioned that for our whole teenage life, this was like the place, the door that opened us up to so much new music. I mean, why does it hurt so much that it sucks now?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned before, it just felt like such a wonderful source of truth almost, like I'd have friends who would recommend albums by artists I never heard of before, and the first thing I would do is say, this Pitchfork reviewed this, what does Pitchfork think of this? And if Pitchfork thinks it's trash, I'm probably just going to, I mean, whatever, I'm not even going to bother with it, that's just changed like completely. Like that sort of concept just doesn't really happen anymore. You know, I don't really look to Pitchfork as a source of truth all that much, you know, because
isn't it incredible that their new tagline is the most trusted site for music or whatever it is? Ironic.
But yeah, I basically completely agree with you, Darren. You know, for much of my life, yeah, if somebody told me to check out a band, or if I saw a band was opening for somebody I was going to see, first thing you do, look it up on Pitchfork. You know, have they ever got a B&M? If they haven't, you know, what's their highest score they've ever got? You know, if somebody didn't at least touch a 7.5, 8, I'd call them garbage straight out.
If they're not even reviewed on Pitchfork, forget about it. Like,
no thanks, no thanks. But yeah, I mean, it was just it seemed like it was at the time the only like centralized, trustworthy thing on like the music that wasn't that, you know, that was outside the scope of like Rolling Stone or, you know, just the radio. Just it was like the only place to hear, you know, when a band you liked was touring, you know, and even you know, releasing an album, or just it was just the only like centralized place to get news about bands that didn't get covered anywhere else.
Yeah, I think that's key, is that, you know, and I think some people might, you know, think we're being a bit silly and over dramatic. There are a bunch of people who are going to say, oh, Pitchfork always sucked, or Pitchfork started sucking in, I don't know, 2005 or something like that. And, you know, sure, maybe for you, but I think that there was like a good decade there where it genuinely changed my life, because I was used to these sort of like authoritative sources, and I think we all were, and the people who say stuff like that are being a little dishonest, but these sources like Rolling Stone or All Music Guide, that, you know, when something got 5 stars, it was like a solidified classic. You know, it was something you could just tell it was like this kind of classic rock kind of thing. It was set in stone. And, you know, when I discovered Pitchfork and they would recommend something like, for some reason I always think about Animal Collective's Sun Tongs, okay? You know, such a weird album, right? Totally weird. Sounds like anybody could have made it. And they were saying, this is a classic on par with like Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin or something. And I was like, what? You know, what? How could that be? These are just, this just sounds like a couple of nobodies like around a campfire, you know, playing weird, freaky folk music. How could this be on that level? And just to have the balls to say that, I mean, it really blew my mind. And I started to be like, they're right. You know, this crazy shit is just as good. And to me, what's revolutionary about that is that first indie wave of that early 2000s, like kind of late 90s to early 2000s thing that Pitchfork came up on, made their name with, it had that kind of punk revolution element where you listened to it and you felt like, not only could I maybe do this, like I could make a masterpiece in my bedroom, you know, with just like one computer mic. I mean, that was so exciting. I think that's why Pitchfork was so dear to me. They told me that I could be, you know, a legend. Right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you know, I basically felt the same way. When I was younger, like before I knew of Pitchfork, even though it had existed, you know, you didn't really have, outside of like looking through your parents' record collection or, you know, going to Best Buy and seeing, you know, a band you've heard of on, you know, the radio or TV or something, and having that, you know, Rolling Stone best album sticker or something.
Right.
Like, that was the only way I knew to find anything, and to like, you know, you couldn't get outside of that like easy box, you know, radio popular world, and like Pitchfork was like a window to this whole other, you know, universe of music and stuff that I didn't know that existed.
I know. You get what I'm saying, like about that personal element, because like I would go to Best Buy and I would think, I'll never make something that is pressed on a CD here in Best Buy.
Oh, no,
you know,
yeah,
like,
exactly.
That's inaccessible. I'll never be Robert Plant, never in my life, you know. But I could be, you know, like A.V. Tare, you know what I mean? I could make a what was big back then, you know, Pure Volume page or whatever that website was, a MySpace, and I could promote this stuff I made in my living room. You know what I'm saying, Darren?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and I think that we, you know, back in those days when we were in a band and stuff, we found that incredibly inspiring because, you know, we started with the big ticket names like Nirvana, right? And of course Nirvana is on Pitchfork, but within Nirvana reviews you get stuff about, Sonic Youth, Pixies. You start to dig deeper. It was so easy to just, find all these different avenues. And Pitchfork, it's almost like the writers knew, or they were somehow just so connected to that idea of, you start with something that's like kind of a mainstream or well-known, and then you can kind of like deconstruct it, break it down, and find all these different like very similar sounds, but stuff that's just not as popular for whatever reason. But, they would make it seem equally as important as, Nirvana or anybody else. And no one else was just doing that. There was just not, I don't know. Like I could just go to Pitchfork because I was like, you know what? I need new music. I need to update my iPod, whatever. You know what I mean? Let me just troll Pitchfork for a couple hours, and I would come away with like 10 brand new artists I'd never heard of and all these great albums. And, there's just nowhere else I could have gone to do that.
Yeah. And something about, like I think you were just sort of getting to, and I think we'll talk more about, but when it came to old music as well, it was sort of like, hey, this thing, I don't know if I could think of a random example, like, some Mogwai record or whatever that AllMusic gave, 3.5 stars and Rolling Stone didn't review. And they're like, actually, I guess that wouldn't have been old at the time, but, actually this is a classic, or this album that came out, I don't know, in the airplane over the sea. It's like, I don't know, AllMusic gave it like 4 stars. Rolling Stone probably didn't talk about it. No, it's a classic. It's a 10 out of 10 classic. It was rewriting the history books for people. Well, yeah, you're right.
Bad example.
Yeah, they first reviewed it. They gave it a 8 point something, but then they bumped it up. But around the time I started reading, it was like they had this body of reviews that was kind of like, these things that you never heard of are classics. And it was like a new musical history that I had missed. But we'll get back to all this kind of stuff. But what's different about it today? I mean, I think we could get into their top 10 or their top albums and top songs list from this year as sort of an example. But it sounded like you were going to say something, Dan?
Yeah, I think the main thing that's wrong with it is kind of it's become the opposite of what we were just talking about. It used to be this window into another world, and now it's just a window into the regular world. The top stories are always about, and as much as I love them, Kanye, which that would, that makes the regular news, and they talk about just all these bands and stuff that are on the radio or are real famous, and I feel like they've lost maybe I just know all the Pitchfork stuff now, but it's like, it's not this window to another world anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, Darren, why don't you, we've got the top 10 of 2018, which, these lists were just published a month or so ago. So Darren, why don't you read this off for us?
Okay. So number 10, we had Eve Toomer with Safe in the Hands of Love. Number 9, Tierra Whack with Whack World. Number 8, Low with Double Negative. Number 7, Earl Sweatshirt, Some Rap Songs. Number 6, Rosalia with, I'm going to butcher this, El Mal Querer. Number 5, Snail Mail, Lush. Number 4, Robin with Honey. Number 3, DJ Cozy with Knock Knock. Number 2, Casey Musgraves with Golden Hour. And number 1 was Mitski with Be the Cowboy.
Yeah, so I think we should get into what you were just saying, Dan, because I don't really feel like any of this stuff is really getting played on the radio, and yet I do know what you mean. And I should mention some notable weirdness that might actually contribute to this part of the conversation. But Ariana Grande's Sweetener came in at number 11, just outside the top 10. So that's exactly, that's, Billboard charts. Cupcake was rated as the second best rap album of the year. That was one of our most hated. That was one of the things that made me start to think, should we continue this metaphoric thing? Pitchfork on their list, we didn't get to talk about this, and I do kind of regret it, but they backed off a little bit on their insane hype of the 1975 by giving them only the 21st best album of the year, although they did give one of their songs the best song of the year honors. There was no Kids See Ghosts on the list, which a lot of people liked. Car Seat Headrest, same thing. Father John Misty, Mount Erie, Tim Hecker. A lot of those things got BNMs, but they were replaced mysteriously by a bunch of non-BNMs that were kind of poppier type of thing. So, what do you think about that, Dan? I mean, it's not like exactly radio stuff, but why doesn't it feel as exciting, like a window into this world nobody knows about?
Yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, it's not like, well, Ariana Grande at number 11, that is...
And the 1975 as well.
Exactly. But yeah, the top 10, it's not exactly like radio music, but it's also, it's not obscure, really. It's kind of like the easiest level of indie. I don't mean that to sound like a, dick, even though I am, but you know what I mean. Like it's Eve Toomer is like maybe the only like sort of obscure weird thing. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, here's my problem. This list, by old Pitchfork standards, and I don't mean to just be so like, well, old Pitchfork versus new Pitchfork, but I mean, this just would never have happened. This would never have happened. Ariana Grande would not get a single mention.
Wouldn't even get reviewed.
Not an article, not a thing, not at all in old Pitchfork. It just wouldn't have happened,
And let's also clarify that it's a completely ordinary album. It's actually not good.
Yes, I agree with you. It's very bad.
Not to get too deep into it, but I did give it a shot after their pretty glowing 8.0 review, I think. And
same, yep.
It's another one of those cases of like Pharrell produced like 6 of the tracks, and Pharrell is really good. So those are good tracks, and the rest are completely mediocre, disposable pop trash. I think we'll talk more about the pop side of things here, but yeah, continue, Darren.
Yeah, and so the thing that really frustrates me by this list is that the very simple fact that they did just replace a bunch of B&Ms. Like, what does it mean? Right. What does it mean to just be a B&M, have the best new album for 1 week, but then you're not good enough to make it to an end of the year list? I feel like there should have been some sort of asterisk, or like, here's a little update on the review, or here's why this album was best new music for this, this particular week, but now it didn't make our list because maybe it just kind of lost its, whatever. Like, to me, as if I was like a brand new, music listener, and I was coming to Pitchfork for the first time, and I see an album got a B&M, and I don't see it on the list, like, it just wouldn't make any sense. I feel like something else should have been said, by the end of the year, to sort of say, okay, we did give this a B&M originally, but like something,
I know, and then, like you said, the Ariana Grande only got a 8 or so. It didn't get B&M'd, and it's at number 11. I can see something that's, number 30 something or 40 something. Yeah. Slipping through. Well, but number 11,
they actually they talk about it. They have like a little miniature review there, so you kind of get an idea of like, all right, so maybe there's a reason why it didn't get a B&M originally, but now it's on the end of the year list. But all those albums that did get a B&M, they don't get mentioned at all.
Right? Yeah. I mean, it's a credibility problem, and Pitchfork has always had this kind of going on in a to a lesser extent, but it's just a lot more so now, where something that seemed like it was supposed to be a B&M, I guess they're admitting they're wrong about that, or same thing, vice versa. But what it really screams to me, and of course there's also the issue of like, a 8.6 will beat like a 9.2 at the end of the year somehow. And I'm okay with a little wiggling and stuff, and things grow on you and whatever. Right. But it reeks of this. The list is not like just a straight up ranking. It's more of like, we crafted this list to represent what we want it to represent. And it's a little dishonest, and they're trying to make this kind of identity. Now, we talked a little bit about it before, but their identity used to be, and we didn't get into this, but it used to be like really against the grain. Like, we're not your dad's fucking Rolling Stone magazine. We'll put a review of Jet with like a monkey pissing in its own mouth, and we'll just completely talk. We'll hand out like zeros. We'll give like whatever, like a Tool album, like a 0.4 or something. They were like really against the grain. Yeah, and then same thing on the flip side, where it's like, yeah, this weird like freak folk album with a 12-minute like just basically drone and moaning track right in the middle of it. That's a 9.5. Sorry. It was really, really exciting. And now, I guess, Dan, you were saying their identity is a little bit more safe. It's a little bit more entry level. But, well, I guess we'll get into it. But I mean, what is their identity now? If you had to describe Pitchfork as a magazine that blank today, what would you say?
Yeah, that's tough. I don't know. I think that it's the lack of identity. It's hard to even come up with it.
That's a good point, actually.
Well, and I think that we'll probably get into this discussion when we start talking about the differences of those two subjects that we mentioned, or that we're going to mention. You know what I mean? But like before, the idea, I feel like if you were a fan of Pitchfork, it didn't necessarily mean that somehow your taste in music was better than others. It was just that you had a particular taste. Like they were crafting that taste for you. And now they have expanded in so many different ways that you find yourself kind of torn between like, well, Pitchfork is still kind of old Pitchfork in some ways because they still do cover, new artists, indie, underground kind of stuff. But then there's all this other stuff that's like kind of flooded the area that they've allowed in to make it sort of more difficult to navigate, right? And you get the headlines like Dan had mentioned. And that what does it mean when you have all these new headlines? Well, you're burying the stuff that you would have been there for 10 years ago, right? So
yeah, that's true.
It's almost like an identity crisis at this point.
Yeah, it is a little bit of, I think that and we'll get into this, the God's honest truth is that it's just hard for one site to be good at everything. Now, Pitchfork is, I think, notoriously just awful at stuff like electronic music, jazz, experimental. They just have these little token artists. We've talked about this, Dan, where it's just like Kamasi Washington is their jazz artist. You can count on him to get a B&M every once in a while, and somebody like Tim Hecker is their experimental guy. They just really sort of just excel. They used to excel rather at this kind of indie rock thing. And then I think what you're getting at, Darren, is they've moved a lot of like pop and rap and stuff into it. And it creates this kind of scattered thing where you're constantly like, okay, so if I'm looking at Pitchfork's like body of work, something like Arcade Fire is as good as Cardi B. It's like disorienting. Casey Musgraves is as good as the Microphones or Neutral Milk Hotel or something. It's like it creates this really weird thing. And it's the same thing with some of their, and I want to talk about this a little bit later, but some of they do these like 70s lists, best album of the 70s, best album of the 80s, and they're just kind of like mixing like jazz with like soul and funk and R&B with pop and rock, and you're just like, how do you say that jazz album is like a one spot better than that dance pop album? It's like bizarre. But I think what we're getting to, I think like the biggest part of this conversation is I've got a couple culprits here of what's gone wrong with Pitchfork, and we're already kind of getting there, but maybe you guys will have more. But I think the first one is poptimism. Okay, so for people who are not in the know, these are sort of critical movements. There's rockism and there's poptimism. So I'll read like the first paragraph of the Wikipedia page on it. Rockism is the belief in certain values thought to be intrinsic to rock music, making the genre superior to other forms of popular music. A rockist may also be someone who regards rock music as the normative state of popular music. Poptimism, or popism, is the belief that pop music is as worthy of professional critique and interest as rock music. Detractors of poptimism describe it as a counterpart of rockism that instead privileges the most famous or best-selling pop, hip-hop, and R&B acts. So I think we can all agree that Pitchfork has a strong poptimist bent right now. How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they definitely do. I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing, having a raucous bent can, you kind of want to be somewhere in the middle, I feel like,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being more inclusive, right?
Right.
I think, I'll pick out an artist like Robin. Like, Pitchfork has sort of adored Robin, and she's right up there in the sort of like Lady Gaga and Katy Perry in terms of like content, like the music itself, right? But in terms of popularity, it's wildly different, I would say. But that I feel like makes sense. I mean, to discover somebody like Robin, a pop artist who's actually not like
popular,
heavily played on the radio, right? It's like, that's kind of interesting. This is sort of the Pitchfork that I love, right? But then they throw Ariana Grande like a number 11 on their end of the year list. Like, what are they trying to say with that sort of thing? Like, to me, old Pitchfork would probably be a little more on the rockism side, right?
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, and new Pitchfork is now is not in the middle, like you mentioned, Dan. They're leaning more and more poptimist, right?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point that I hadn't thought of. That poptimism could be just fine if Pitchfork was still an alternative music website, and that there was alternative pop that they would be arguing is worth your time.
Yes.
I think everybody would be totally on board with that. The issue with poptimism is that I think it's a great idea in theory, but it can like go wild because people are dismissive. They have these certain like biases and assumptions that make them really dismissive of great music, right? So you can think about something like, God, I don't know, disco or something like that. And you can be like, well, that's just for fun. It's repetitive. It's mindless. For dancing. Yeah, it's mindless. It's just for dancing. It's just for fun. Like those aren't artists, capital A artists, and there, I guess there's an argument to be had, but I would say that you would be depriving yourself of a ton of incredible music if you just looked around at what was popular, what was like what seems like pure mindless pop, and just dismissed it all.
Right.
And you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think of like Lady Gaga as one of those artists who kind of qualifies as like mainstream dance music. Everybody kind of knows it, right? But at the if I were to just completely say, too many people listen to Lady Gaga, I'm not gonna partake in that.
Right.
We would be missing out on some of the best pop music that's out there, right? And that is a more raucous or rockism type of stance, right? And is that the right thing to do, just to completely shun stuff like that? Or is there another way that you can engage that type of music but not have to like feel like, well, we have to critique the entire album, because that's how we critique music? How is Lady Gaga's entire album, not just that song that's great?
That's an assumption, right? That's another one of these raucous assumptions that I think people like Pitchfork are trying to say that we all have and we need to sort of shake loose of, is we value things based on like what Rolling Stone taught us, that sort of personal, Bob Dylan song, you write your own lyrics. They're from your mind. They're like a window into you as like an auteur. You design all the music and stuff like that. It's your vision. The Beatles, another great example. And if you aren't doing those things, if you sing somebody else's songs or you use like the Motown studio band, right. You don't have like the agency that the Beatles have or whatever. You are sort of disposable trash. You know what I mean, Dan?
Yeah, and God forbid you do anything electronic. It's just computers making the music, or God forbid you sample something.
Right. Yeah, that's not art. That's always like there's art and then there's pop, and that's always the divide. And I think it's very worth breaking that down and really looking hard at that. Some of my problem though is that, like I said, it can go too far. There's a lot of mainstream pop that I think is worth singling out. we could say that like Beyonce's Lemonade was actually a good record.
Agreed.
But there's stuff like, Ariana Grande. I can't really tell the difference between her and Katy Perry. And Katy Perry is not good, and Pitchfork doesn't say she's good. And there really doesn't seem to be much of a difference. Lady Gaga, I remember, around 2010, 2009, thinking that Bad Romance song was like the most incredible thing I had ever heard. And that was kind of before Pitchfork went poptimist. And I remember thinking like, why doesn't Pitchfork review this? Like, this song is incredible, Right. It's just as good as all the indie stuff I like. And I mean, if you could strike a balance, it would be, I think, a really important thing. Another aspect of this, though, is that I think is related is the sort of, we were talking earlier about Pitchfork's lists, like 70s albums, 80s albums, 90s albums. They sort of are redoing all these lists and like poptimizing them. And isn't it weird where you see stuff like, Nina Simone is better than, like any Bob Dylan album or something like that?
Yeah, that last, what was it, the 70s, that last one? It was really odd, there was all kinds of that stuff. Not to say that Nina Simone isn't great, she is, but she's no Bob Dylan,
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's one of those assumptions, and I want to know, are they necessarily bad assumptions? Because what I want to say is Nina Simone cannot be as good as Bob Dylan because, the albums that they put on the list, and they put a lot of them, her, Aretha Franklin, they stood out to me because they are your typical kind of, there are a couple masterpiece songs there, and then there's a bunch of stuff that the label wanted where there's like a couple covers, a couple sort of weak ballads, and they were recorded just all at different times. Nothing was put together to be an album or anything like that. Just sort of slapped together, and incredible songs on there. Couple incredible songs, but not a good album, capital A album. So these raucous assumptions that the artist needs to write everything, they need to think on a big conceptual level about the presentation and the album. They go to write songs and they say, these songs belong together in this one big piece. Pitchfork would want to say that those are raucous assumptions we should throw out the window, but should we?
Yeah, I don't think we should. If anybody listened to the, old podcasts and stuff, I like a nice packaged record. If you're making a record, like I like a good, good sequencing. You should think about all of that. We always talked about, the sequencing of the record being bad, or being great. And I love that like world building of like an album sounding like one piece of work, like each song is a part of the painting. I like that a lot personally. So I think that does qualify it.
Filthy raucous.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
I know.
yes. I mean, I was going to say, like, is that something that has just changed? You know what I mean? Like, are the times changing? Like, is that an old idea?
I think the times are changing, but I'm going to be that old boomer that's sticking with it. I'll
mean, because where do you draw the line? Because you'd be like, okay, Drake's last album was so long, he obviously didn't give a shit about the pacing or anything. It was just to put as many songs on Spotify as possible and get as many streams as possible, and maybe some of them would become hits. And it makes sense to me to say it is thus a bad album. But if you wanted to go full-blown poptimist, you would have to say, no. That doesn't matter. That's very raucous to say that. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if the album is bad. It's still good. Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
No, yeah.
Right.
I'm
like
going...
Everything is suddenly good now. Like,
yeah,
now you're not taking any sides at all.
Yeah. Things that are bad are actually good. That's the poptimist mantra, I think.
So let me ask you guys, because this is something I've always kind of had on my mind, because... Again, I think when I was younger, I was probably much more of a raucous type of person, right?
Sure.
I really was that person who was like, well, Britney Spears doesn't write a single song. She can't play any instruments, right?
Yeah.
She could never be as good as Bob Dylan. But then, as I started to get into like hip hop and stuff, and you read the liner notes on a lot of these records, Kanye West, whatever, you see that he like writes songs with a lot of people. Like there's a lot of collaboration, groups of people that are involved, and you start to wonder, I mean, I think the assumption is that still the main artist, Kanye, whoever it may be, had the bulk of the production there. But do they? And we don't really know. I mean, a single song could have 20 collaborators on it, and we don't. It's not like the liner notes indicate, well, Drake wrote like 5 lines here, whatever.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Really know. So how does that sort of change how hip hop artists are looked at, or are they just kind of somehow above that? Because of their persona or whatever.
I used to think, the same way you just described when I was younger and stuff too. And hip hop is also what changed that for me. And, how I think of it now, it's like, if you say Stanley Kubrick made 2001 Space Odyssey, like he didn't do everything in that. He's just like the one who's in charge. And, especially with hip hop, and we talked about this with Kanye on the old podcast and stuff. Like, he is like the director or the conductor of this, like, symphony of other people. And I think, like, once I realized that, it makes me not care so much, But also, I guess it sort of depends on the music. If it's something simple like, a guy playing, like if Bob Dylan's, albums weren't original music, that would maybe lose a little sincerity. Does it? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it's the type of music.
I think, it's the auteur theory, which I do kind of subscribe to. I think, which is that good art has to be like a single person, the auteur, their vision, and you can use a whole team to help construct your vision, or you can do it completely on your own, like, microphones or something, record every little piece. But once it's this kind of assembly line kind of thing, like it becomes a product rather than a piece of art. And, that's all I think Ariana Grande is. Now, maybe you would argue that she's kind of like a Beyonce light, where she's really in charge of this branding, and she's done this amazing job creating this persona and stuff. But, I think there's something different where, maybe, Jay-Z or something. He didn't make, I don't know, any beat or anything like that, any of the music on, maybe he suggested samples, I don't know, but like on the Blueprint. But the Blueprint is such a unified, picture of him at that moment, the things he's thinking about, the things he's going through, everything serves his vision.
He picked the beats, It's not like it's not like the record label said, here are your, 12 beats or however many songs are on that. Now get to rapping. I'm sure he probably went through 100 beats, listening.
100 beat makers.
Yeah, exactly. And then he came out with, however many tracks are on that record, those many beats, and that, he put together the picture. And the thing too.
So I think that's important.
The real Rockdist thing of, Led Zeppelin, they played all their instruments, they wrote all their songs, whatever. Like, they didn't engineer that record, I don't think people realize, how much is behind the scenes when making a record on these, like, rock things that people feel like they did all by themselves. They really didn't.
Right. Well, I mean, I think bands like Led Zeppelin and the Beatles are fairly safe because they already qualify as like, well, they wrote their own music, they played their own instruments, yada, yada. But here's what I'm curious about, because I hear you guys kind of, Gabe, you mentioned the whole vision thing. But what I really want to know is, I want to draw this comparison between art and then specifically music. So like with art, is the only good high art that is painted or sculpted? If you were to say yes to that, then like with music, is the only high art music that is played on like actual instruments and the whole songwriting thing? Like, can Ariana Grande be a Beyonce? Can she ever be on par with a Bob Dylan record? Can that ever even happen?
I mean, I think that, we get into that with when it comes to art and stuff. Obviously, it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but something like, Andy Warhol or something is, he's playing with the idea, he's sampling, quote unquote. And he, is playing with that idea of like, what is art, right? And I think a lot of good like pop, I always felt like Lady Gaga was doing this, was also kind of similarly playing with like this sort of self-conscious pop star thing. And there's a lot of room to be really interesting there. But I don't think it's necessary, and I think it's a difficult question when you ask, could Ariana Grande ever be as good as Bob Dylan? Because instinctively I say no, and I think those are those sort of rockist assumptions that are really hard to shake loose. Mm-hmm. Like we said, though, I think some of them are good assumptions to have, but they are the kind of things that make you just dismiss like disco as a whole, or just miss out completely on like, whatever house music,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, do I think a pop person could ever, make something as good as or close to as good as Bob Dylan? Yeah, I think so. And I think, Kanye qualifies, as a pop artist. And I think My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy is, in the same realm as Bob Dylan and, the Beatles and stuff. So I think, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's fair. Does that make sense, Darren? Do you disagree?
I don't disagree. I mean, I would obviously agree when you mention like Kanye West, but I also don't really think of Kanye West in the same league as any of the, other pop, artists that we've sort of mentioned, Lady Gaga, even Katy Perry, things like that. Like I just, I wonder if there is like just some sort of
do you mean like
of mute,
like not a hip hop artist, like a pure, bubblegum pop artist? Is that sort of what you mean? Like, could somebody like that
basically because I think Kanye is just he's like a rare example, because he's sort of like, he's like bridging a gap that most artists just haven't really done, they're either strictly hip hop or strictly pop.
I think this kind of leads us to the dirty and dark part of the rockist versus poptimist debate, which is issues of race and gender, because calling somebody a rockist is kind of like calling them a racist at this point, or a sexist, because part of what's baked into that, and I think this is very accurate, is that all the things we've been talking about, it's like women and people of color don't make real music. That's been like the sort of the gut thing that rock has really screwed itself up doing, not taking those people seriously. And, I think that is certainly extremely troubling, and something that I try to be conscious of when I, instinctively think that, Ariana Grande sucks and can never be good or something. I'm like, am I having this kind of like sexist reaction? Like she's just like not just a woman, but she's like this young, pretty girl or something. How could she be intelligent? I think you guys would agree, right? It's like important that we try to avoid doing those things, and Pitchfork's poptimist bent has probably done a lot to repair some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I could see it repairing it. I mean, a good portion of the top 10 was women. Right. Most of it, really, even. So yeah, I could see some repair happening.
And if you think about it, it's like they're doing the same. When we were young and they were just like, "Fuck you, Animal Collective is just as good as Led Zeppelin." We were like, "Wow, that's awesome." And now they're kind of doing the same thing, where they're like, "Fuck you, Ariana Grande is just as good as Father John Misty."
Yeah.
It's a similar. I'm trying to find the positive here. You know what I'm saying, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, there's, like I mentioned, maybe this is. The times are changing here, and this is Pitchfork pivoting and attempting to sort of change their original stance on a lot of stuff, and obviously Pitchfork is not a singular entity that's comprised of dozens and dozens of writers that have changed over the years, right? I mean,
that's true. I mean, but it's still they try to craft. They have like some sort of editor in chief that sort of crafts this identity, you know. And that identity.
You think they have like an
changed.
agenda, like they almost set out to?
I think so. I really do, because my Pitchfork theory, in short, is that the stuff we were talking about before is that was their identity, is this kind of indie music, this DIY, like you could do this at home kind of stuff. And then when indie started to reach like peak popularity, you know, it's like Arcade Fire wins a Grammy and stuff like that. You know, they made this bold move that they must have thought long and hard about to give My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy a perfect 10. And that was like the moment that I think everything started to change, where, you know, because before, if it was about, hey, anybody could do this, you know, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy is like, no one but fucking Kanye West could do this. You know, exactly. It was the literal opposite of what Pitchfork had been and what the early 2000s music had been. And ever since then, we've been in this thing where everything that B&M, this entire list, this top 10 list here, is all like, you're supposed to be in awe at its, you know, at its like professionalism, at its size, at its sheen. You know, lo-fi is so out of style. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you know, I think Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy is a good, you know, that is the like turning point, you know, for the good or the bad. Yeah, I don't know.
And then another note on the, you know, because I think there's more to say about the social aspects, the diversity aspects, but, you know, thinking again, preparing for this episode, looking back at some of those best albums of the 70s list, best albums of the 80s list, you know, they do create this really interesting thing, like we were talking about, where, you know, Nina Simone is right on par with the Beatles and Bob Dylan. And, you know, I think they're trying to say, and I think it's a fine thing to say, that, you know, the only reason you don't think of her as an artist, capital A artist on their level, is because of the kind of racism and sexism that's baked into these rockist attitudes. Now, what I would say is that, like we were talking about earlier, her albums are not actual albums. They're just like the label just put together some of her songs, and some of them are masterpieces, and some of them are kind of throwaway filler, and all of her albums like that are just like that. And I think those are like the good rockist assumptions. And I also think it's like a hard thing for me to articulate. I was thinking about it today, that if you looked, what they're kind of doing is like revising history. Okay. So if some like young chap my age when I first discovered Pitchfork took a look at their like best albums of the 60s list, they would think like, wow, I guess there was no like racism in the 60s, because, you know, this is like a really diverse list. And in some ways that's good, but in other ways, the thing is, it was super racist. And part of the reason why Nina Simone never got to be Bob Dylan is because she was never given like the freedom and the agency to like pretend like she got in a motorcycle accident, disappear for 2 years, and, you know, come out like just go country for a couple albums if she wanted, or make a double album of crazy surrealist shit. You know what I mean? Like, she actually didn't have those opportunities. Same with like Aretha Franklin and all those people. And so ironically, there's something that's like very problematic about trying to retroactively fix it. Those albums are not as good. And if you, like, what's worse, pretending like they are, or saying the reason they're not as good is because
it's
of
like
the disadvantage?
Do you give them a handicap, you know, like a couple extra points because
right. It's like you're rating the performance and less of, you know, the songwriting and the album structure and all this kind of stuff.
I think you just have to, you know, obviously, you know, that's bad and everything, but like, if you want to make a list of the best albums, you have to, you know, this album is better than that album. And I don't think you have to look at like what's around it. I think you can just say this album is better than that album, you know?
So would the proper thing to have done perhaps would be to like get rid of like a ranking order and just say,
like a list.
If you
like
were interested in
records.
the 60s, if you're interested in the 60s, here are the albums you should be listening to.
I honestly, I think
they're all.
I think that is a better idea for basically anybody making these kind of lists, because, you know, you brought this up earlier, Gabe, like when you put obviously you have to bring up jazz records when you talk about the 60s or whatever, but they're hard to, it's hard to say, like, is, this Coltrane record as good as Dylan? It's apples and oranges.
Right.
It's two different styles. So yeah, when you make a list of just like, here's 100 records that existed in the 60s that you should hear, I think that is a good way to do it. But they don't do that because that's not as clickbaity, and everyone wants to argue about that.
And we'll get to that. We'll get into the clickbait aspect of the short. There's just a couple other questions that I have about this, which are, so obviously the diversity in music thing is good. I feel sort of skeptical about trying to fix the past in the way I was just talking about, but going forward, I think that it is a nice idea to say that, let's get rid of these biases that make you not take like women artists as seriously or whatever. It can go crazy though, because what it comes down to a lot is that they're praising, in my opinion, cultural impact over quality. And I think a lot of people have noticed that Pitchfork reviews have become like a lot less about the music and more just about like the surrounding context, So somebody like Cardi B, she's basically, I think she got an 8.6 on her debut album, and they called it like a classic and everything. They gave an 8.6 to Cardi B as an icon, basically. Didn't matter what that album sounded like. That's a problem, right?
Yes, definitely. Because I agree. That album was surprisingly good, but yeah, it wasn't a classic. What would they say, the pantheon of great rappers or something? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
You can't give her that off of just that record alone. And then things like Kids See Ghost, that the review for that mentions Donald Trump more than it mentions Kid Cudi, one of the people on the actual record, and they give that and Yay. I think both of those were left off the end of the year list, especially Kids See Ghost, because of Kanye tweeting about Trump more than anything else, and the crazy shit he gets up to. But I want to know, is this Cardi B record good? When I go to Pitchfork, or is this whoever record good? That's all I care about. I don't care who's tweeting what or anything.
Right.
Like I just want to hear good records.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to contextualize an album, like, in the time that it's coming out. And certainly some albums, artists fully intend to, for its listeners to be in the moment and be thinking about what's going on in society. I mean, that's their intent. But as a review, that you're writing something that, you hope in 3, 4, 5 years, somebody will pick up and, be interested in this artist or this album based on the, how you have reviewed the music. And I think if they just sort of minimized a little bit of that, social commentary and injecting their own sort of thoughts into that sort of thing, I think it would be better. I think it's still important to mention, certainly like keep things in there. I mean,
sure.
There's no, if you're reading the Kids See Ghost review, you should know that like this is a time when Kanye was, wearing a MAGA hat all the time. I mean, that I think that's important to note.
But is it though?
Dominate the entire review, but
I think it is important because it was like, there's something about, we've talked about this before, of course it's a new podcast, so I shouldn't say that, but that like the lead up to My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy contributed to it being a classic. I mean, a lot of classics, they come at this like moment, just some of the ones we've talked about, like The Blueprint was like Jay-Z's like artistic comeback, there's like just this, it's the debut of Kanye West as a producer and all this, it's like a new sound. There's got to be this context there that to sort of elevate it. I don't know if it's always necessary, but
I do agree with you, especially with like Dark Twisted and stuff. But does that mean in, 50 years or something, when, our grandkids discover My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, do they have to read a book about it to like, before they listen to know? Or can they just, pick it up and say this is a great record?
I think it enhances the experience. It's just like, it's the
no,
same.
No, it definitely enhances
to read about the Beatles, right?
No, I mean, there's a difference.
True. And I always think about this, like when I, like, not that I'm like crazy about Led Zeppelin anymore, but like when you put on, because when I was a kid, I was listening to like a lot of classic rock, when I'm in high school. And then it was like one day it kind of clicked.
Raucous,
that, like,
obviously.
Yeah, it kind of clicked, that the first Led Zeppelin album came out in 68? Mm-hmm. And I was like thinking about what the rest of music sounded like in 68. I wasn't comparing it to like all of classic rock. I was suddenly like, holy shit. In 68, this must have been the heaviest thing that anybody ever heard. I mean, nothing is heavier than this in 1968. And it really did deepen my appreciation for it. I didn't maybe need to know it to enjoy it. I don't think you would need to know anything about Kanye to enjoy My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. But knowing about the stuff he was going through, the Taylor Swift stuff, and blah, 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 the death of his mother, that's only going to enhance.
No, I agree that it enhances. I mean, I love reading books about, every little, music thing and everything. But, like, it's not 100% necessary, You can... I feel like the first time I listened to Led Zeppelin 1, I didn't know anything about them. And, now I know more, and sure, maybe that's enhanced it, but I could still see that it was a good record before I even, knew who it was.
Well, that is kind of interesting, actually, because I feel like if you didn't... anybody who didn't like Kids See Ghosts, if you listen to it without knowing the context, you would probably like it.
Exactly.
And then
exactly.
In that case, the context is going to actually make it worse.
Backfire.
Yeah.
Very true.
Maybe that might be actually a good topic for another podcast. And then I think we can sort of switch actually to the thing you brought up earlier, Dan, which is that the clickbait type of stuff. Now, in continuing to diagnose Pitchfork, what's wrong with it? Another major culprit is, Condé Nast, as everybody knows, purchased Pitchfork in 2015. It's a mass media company that owns stuff like GQ, Vanity Fair, some golf magazine, et cetera, et cetera. I think they bought it for like $50 million.
Damn.
So a little while after that, or maybe like a year after that or so, founder and editor-in-chief Ryan Schreiber announced he would be departing, and actually just days ago, he finally completely departed from, his baby, Pitchfork, that he made. And I want to say that Pitchfork is probably wholly his vision, speaking of tours. So it's really an incredible accomplishment, but he's jumped ship, and a lot of other people have jumped ship since then. And actually, I was reading about this today. Pitchfork, after the purchase, started to take sort of it did this big site redesign and everything, and the clicks started to actually, the daily visitors started to sort of slump. And since then, they have amped up the lists we've been talking about, but they also do stuff like, just just often they would do like best IDM albums, best ambient albums, best Pacific Northwest album, just lots and lots of lists because people click on lists. That's why they would never do, even though it actually kind of makes more sense to do a 60s list with no numbers, they would never ever do that. There's a lot of news about like shows and movies for some reason.
Things.
Yes, it's transitioning into like one of those kind of lifestyle brand type of things. There's like sponsored content, like 5 beers to pair with whatever, sponsored by Goose Island or shit like that. A bunch of coverage of stuff that used to be very anti-Pitchfork, like the Grammys or the Oscars or whatever. So does anybody here disagree that has made a major effect, had a major effect on Pitchfork's quality?
Oh, I wholeheartedly agree. If I want to, I don't want movie news from Pitchfork, unless it's like Johnny Greenwood is soundtracking, the soundtrack to this movie. Otherwise, I don't care. I don't care about Stranger Things from Pitchfork. The top story right now is about the Super Bowl. Those are just things I don't go to Pitchfork for. Yeah,
if I were to sort of put like a business cap on just for a moment, I want to at least give Pitchfork maybe the benefit of the doubt here. Clearly they have diversified, they have tried to broaden their reach, and maybe that was because there were fears that they would not be able to survive, just as an outlet. If they were to continue on the way they had back in 2005 or whatever, maybe there just was not a future financially, who knows. But there, to me, Condé Nast was looking for more clicks, because more clicks meant ads, which means, revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
That's kind of the bottom line, unfortunately. And maybe, if it was up to us, and of course we would remove the whole Condé Nast out of it, maybe we wouldn't have Pitchfork anymore. Who knows, right?
Maybe. I kind of feel like they were selling high. They were like, this is the highest, this is the biggest it's going to be. Let's jump out. And, fine. But what's resulted basically is that, we talked about how Pitchfork used to be an alternative music magazine. It used to show you things you didn't know, but people don't really click on that. Dedicated music obsessives click on that. What normal people click on is stuff they already know. So that's why all of Pitchfork's lists and all of Pitchfork's reviews, they just sort of confirm just contemporary culture. Cardi B is popular, she is good. Beyonce is popular, she is good. It's just Ariana Grande, whatever. Throw in a little stuff to kind of maintain their credibility. And in fact, I read something that was like somebody from Condé Nast said that the reason they purchased Pitchfork was because of their millennial male readership, which is very, very illuminating, I think. But so that's why, I remember I was looking, I recently subscribed to the Wire magazine, which is sort of like an experimental leaning magazine. And, just when the end of the year list came out, I was looking on Twitter to see if anybody was talking about it or whatever. And I saw a couple of people making the same joke, something like, wow, I looked at the Wire's list and I've only ever heard of, like 2 things on it. And, they were saying like that's a negative thing. And I was like, that's the most exciting thing to me. That's why I wanted to read it. It was because I want to learn all this new stuff. That's not typical. And I think in today's world, people are used to, they click on a list, an end of the year list, so that it will sort of confirm their opinions. You know what I mean? That this is all,
exactly.
This all has to be a result of Condé Nast purchasing.
No, exactly. I mean, because, people want to go on Reddit or Mew or, whatever forum, and 1, bitch about the list, and 2, gloat about the, whatever artists they like being in the top 10 or being number 1 or whatever. But yeah, I agree with you. I want to click on a year-end list or, a best rap albums of the year, whatever. I want to click on that and find all the stuff I've never heard. And, I recently subscribed to The Wire too, because you told me about it. And I've had yeah. Their end of the year list, which I did. I only knew like 3 or 4 things on it. I printed it out and it's in my desk at work. And, I've been checking stuff. I've been going through, listening to the whole thing, because that's what I want. I want to find 50 new, I just found a list of 45 records I've never heard of that a publication says are fantastic. That makes me very excited. And that's what I want. And that's what I used to get from Pitchfork.
Well, I am not ready to conform, so we'll see what happens in the future. But, I guess the obvious question, and this might lead into one of the problems here, that we might be too old. But back in 2008, there weren't really forums or Reddit or things like that where people would go on and kind of argue about these lists, were there? I mean,
there were. They
we
were
should
just
say though,
the culture that you just described was not a culture that was around in the old Pitchfork days.
Okay, well, a couple of things is that, one, I guess we should clarify that Pitchfork has always really been aggressively about brand building. Mm-hmm. Even when we were young, you could say something like, oh, this is a Pitchfork kind of band, and everybody would know what you're talking about. Like they really built like a identity, they aggressively, grew by putting out really controversial content. Their lists became legendary because they were so irreverent. That they've always sort of been about that, but now it's become a little bit more about clicks, which maybe the reason that is, clicks are better than controversy nowadays, because of the digital changes that you mentioned, Darren. At the same time, I think that, God, I had such a great point. I hope I didn't lose it forever. I think that, God, repeat your question. What was it? Oh yeah. Are we getting old? No, it didn't bring it back.
Are we out of touch?
No, it's the kids who are wrong.
Yeah. All right. Maybe it'll come back to me. But I was going to mention that, when it comes to clicks and things like that, the Oscars, have this constant problem where nobody watches because nobody's seen the movies. You know what I mean? They're always saying that, and the ratings are always declining. And so they toyed around with, bringing in this, best popular movie category.
Blockbusters, yeah.
Yeah, for the blockbusters so that they can get those people to watch. Now so basically what the Oscars are doing is like resisting the transformation that Pitchfork has already accepted, which is like, we want to maintain this kind of dignity of like, these are serious films, this is serious art. It's not to be confused with a fun, popcorn type of movie. With their, eventually I think poptimism is going to hit because of the current climate, the current world. Poptimism is going to hit, the movies, and it kind of is already happening. People are talking about like A Star Is Born, like it's an actually good movie, which it almost certainly isn't. I haven't seen it, but I would put anything on that.
It was a good movie.
Of course you did.
Talk about that later.
Oh Lord. But but then I was thinking about like, what if poptimism hit like food, foodies, it would be like Chili's is actually really good, because people know Chili. They can't go to this like Michelin star restaurant, but they've all gone to Chili's, so they'll click on this article I wrote. You know what I mean?
No, that's good. I do love McDonald's a lot, so I wouldn't.
Right. Okay.
Best new value meal, right?
Yeah, I'm in.
Okay. Another problem could be Pitchfork copycat sites and all these competitors. Stuff like Tiny Mixtapes, Quietus, Stereo Gum, Noisy, The Needle Drop, the stuff that's sort of come out in Pitchfork's wake. And I think I already know the answer to this question, but is it even possible for there to be such a dominant voice? I think this is what I was going to try to get at, Darren, the point I forgot, which is that, the times have changed where Pitchfork just happened at this perfect moment where the internet was becoming a thing, and people would argue about, they would start to argue about reviews, and actually it was for the first time possible to buy stuff that, wasn't carried in, or illegally download rather, stuff that wasn't carried in Best Buy. Pitchfork was kind of right there at the right moment for this revolution to happen that wouldn't have been possible before. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I completely agree. Rolling Stone couldn't cover all, some obscure records that were coming out because, even if they did, you might read it and say, oh, shit, I really want to listen to that record. You go to your local record store and you're shit out of luck because they don't have it, and that's the only one within 100 miles of you, and you'll never have a chance to get that record. But now, basically anything you want, no matter how obscure, is right at your fingertips if you know where to look, and even now, with things like Spotify and stuff, it's even easier. So, yeah, I think it is at the right place at the right time. But, basically everything kind of works that way,
Certainly.
I don't know. To be honest, this will be a topic in the future, I'm sure. But the streaming music and stuff, I feel like is like ruining the way I have always wanted to listen to music in the past, and like ruining albums.
Such
and all
an
that
old
stuff.
man.
We'll talk about that later. I know. You guys remember I was the last one to join
you really
the whole
were.
streaming thing. Hold on to my iPod. Till I died.
Isn't it crazy though? Like the coincidences of things that have sort of lined up in that sense is that like technology has has come to at that time. Technology came to meet the needs of like this new Pitchfork audience, and Pitchfork just happened to be like the first. That's why I was kind of saying that there were so many sites at once. But also now, if we jump ahead to 2018, I just can't get over. I can't even figure out how to phrase this, but poptimism sort of becomes this dominant, critical theory at the same time that Pitchfork is purchased by a basically mass media company, and they have a vested interest in talking about mainstream pop. And it's like, you see what I'm saying? Like, is that a coincidence? Am I like, do I need to put like a tinfoil hat on? Like, it's freaking me out that like, it just so happens. It's kind of like when, I'm trying to think, like, it's kind of like, how everybody wants like restaurants to stop like giving straws out, because like single-use plastics are bad stuff, and like that's good. It's definitely good to reduce the use of single-use plastics, but then there's something funny about the fact that we're like all the consumers are demanding that restaurants stop giving us free straws. You know, they're like, okay, we don't have to buy straws. Okay, fine. There's something weird about that, and it's like a similar irony with Pitchfork, where it's just like at the same time that everybody's interested in pop, they're interested in writing about pop so that we'll click on it more. Like, you see kind of what I'm saying? I think I'm articulating it very badly.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to your original question, though, about, can there be a dominant voice? I feel like Pitchfork could have stood their ground and continued in the direction that they were originally headed in, and could have done something more like what the Oscars are attempting to do, by introducing in a much more segregated way, I guess, more of this clickbaity stuff, more of, their more conversations regarding what's going on in mainstream pop culture, either through some sort of subsidiary site or something totally different. I don't know. But, the problem is, like we mentioned before, this identity crisis where, like, they're still trying to be like the old Pitchfork of, like, trying to show you brand new things you've never heard of. And at the same time, they're also trying to be in the conversation of, like, mainstream pop media. And unfortunately, there's just not room to be able to, like, do all of that and be a dominant voice, right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, they basically traded like high level engagement from people like us who would check Pitchfork every day, and read the reviews and stuff like that. I eagerly await the review of these new upcoming albums. Mm-hmm. They traded that for kind of low level clicks, like quick, just glance at the score and leave. Yeah. But at least the advertisers
it was a numbers game. I tell you right now, Condé Nast probably hired in some, consultants, and they reviewed Pitchfork's data over the years. They're like, this Gabe Lonsberry guy spends like 30 minutes on a single page. I mean, that's not getting us anything, guys.
No, yeah, they don't.
I know,
they don't give a shit if you read it at all. If you like it, you hate it. As long as you click on it and they get that ad revenue, or and those numbers to sell more ads, that's
they need you to jump through the site. They need you to click through different pages over and over again, not sit on a single page and read through an entire review. Exactly. They don't want you to do that.
I bet if they could if they thought they could get away with it, they would just put the number for the review.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean, and I just can't get over the strange coincidence that poptimism comes into vogue right as this is happening, and just there's just something so creepy about it. I don't know, but a couple because then you can say that it's like they have an honorable, you can be like they're selling out, and now they're trying to say actually selling out is the honorable thing to do. Like actually the only reason you don't want us to sell out is because you're a racist and a sexist. You know what I mean? It's like this perfect just storm happened. Anyway, a couple other just last few things I wanted to ask you guys, which Darren brought up earlier. Is it really Pitchfork's fault? I think we have to spend at least 5 minutes, self inspecting here. Where one thing I thought of, did indie just collide with the mainstream, and now indie is mainstream?
I think so. I mean, indie music and stuff, especially, in the past, it was underground. People use that term because you couldn't find it, on the streets. And now with the internet, you could find anything. So, everything's sort of on like this kind of level playing field that didn't ever exist until, just a few years ago. And then, things like Arcade Fire won the Grammy and everything. And I think indie really has collided with the mainstream completely.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm inclined to agree. I think that things have shifted dramatically. If you guys remember our time in high school, there were certainly kids out there who thought of Modest Mouse as like this, incredible underground band.
Yeah, I was one of them.
As like Float On exploded. They're like, oh man, like, what a bunch of sellouts, this and that. Like I knew them before they were big. Does that sort of conversation even happen anymore? Like,
I don't think so. And I genuinely feel like a lot of mainstream pop and stuff is like weirdly, especially in rap, is like weirdly what I would call indie. You know, like Frank Ocean is incredibly popular, but his music is weird.
He doesn't get like played on the radio,
No, but even something like that, even something that does. I'm trying to think of like, Future or something.
I mean,
there's something weird about Future. He's like barely speaking. He's just like sort of like this like guttural like noise he's making. It's like Tibetan throat singing meets like, and even just trap. I was joking then, by the way, but just trap in general. It's so minimal. It's like such like empty space. It's like post punk for rap, or something. I mean, I really feel like mainstream music today is pretty indie, which does make me think that, because it used to be called alternative R&B. I think now we can just say alternative R&B is just R&B. You know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, I mean for sure. Any like straight R&B anymore is the equivalent of dad rock. It's Luther
Right.
Vandross making a record at 84 years old or whatever.
Right. So I mean, I think those are reasons to, again, do a little introspection here and say that maybe that's a reason for Pitchfork's change, even if it did hurt the quality. Another thing, Darren, you mentioned it. Is there any chance that we're getting too old and out of touch, and Pitchfork and popular culture have just sort of moved on without us? I don't really think so, because I'm not just like pining for indie rock to come back. I'm just really bored by all the mediocre stuff that they're BNMing.
Yeah, I don't think it's that at all. I mean, like you said, I'm not pining for any sort of indie rock to come back, and I love rap, I love trap, but I don't love shitty things like Cupcake, and I'm not interested in Casey Musgraves or.
Oh my god! I thought we were gonna make the whole podcast without complaining about Casey Musgraves.
I fucking hate that record so much. Honestly, more than Cupcake. It's just
that's the problem.
It annoys me.
It's very
so
ordinary.
Much. Yeah,
it's extremely ordinary.
I mean, it would be totally cool if There's one line that stuck out in that review, or the miniature review that they wrote when it was the number 2 album, right? So, and it was like, she writes about, what was it? Something country related, but then also acid. And, I listened to the record, and maybe there was a line or something about acid, I suppose, because there's that song that's called, God, I can't think of it. But anyway, like, the point is, no, it's not an album that, like, would trip you out or anything really acid related.
Also, what is it? Fucking basically 1968. Like, people have heard of acid by now. It's
I
not.
know. Yeah, but I'm just so sick of like all these. This is what I felt like our old podcast was becoming. Is every review was like, basically what it came down to is it's pretty good for a blank.
Yeah.
I'm so sick of shit like that. Like Casey Musgraves is pretty good for a country pop album. Fucking Black Panther is pretty good for a comic book movie. Like,
yeah,
can I
don't
get something
want
that's actually good?
Exactly.
Actually good is what I'm missing. And to bring it full circle, like we were talking about before, something like Robin, like there is pop that is good. We don't need to force in all of this shit. And I cannot say, I could be delusional, but I refuse to say it's just because I'm old and I'm out of touch or whatever. It just because music changed without me. No. There is enough good pop where if you are acclaiming shitty stuff, you are, that's selling out. I mean, you're claiming it so that people will click on it and argue about it.
At worst, you're selling out. At best, you're just too lazy to look deeper.
Yes, and there is like sort of a new surface level quality to Pitchfork, like we were also talking about earlier, that I do feel like they used to go a lot deeper.
Again, I know you guys don't like the sound of it, but things have changed so dramatically. Like, I think about my son, my oldest son, right? He's in 8th grade now, and I think about when I was in 8th grade. It was like I was right on the cusp of like starting to listen to like Nirvana and all that kind of stuff, and having my CD and like the one album that I was just going to listen to the whole day and stuff.
God,
like that concept is so foreign to him and all his friends and everything. It's like, oh, check out this Skrillex song on this playlist or whatever. Heard it on Fortnite, whatever. Like, that's how they're like they're consuming music or hearing about it. It's almost like the concept of an album, like sitting down and just listening to a single record is just completely foreign.
I mean,
and I fear that it's only going to get worse.
It's crazy. Like, I mean, even, I remember the same thing, but picking one album for the whole day. If you told me today that I could only listen to one album and the whole, like, I would have to listen to that same album like over and over, I would just not listen to anything.
It'll be funny because it'll actually be funny because, we talk about how it's hard for us to take an album seriously that doesn't work like as a large piece, but pretty soon it's going to be like, it's hard to take Bob Dylan seriously because you have to listen to a bunch of songs in a row and it takes forever, It
really fucks up your
Drake.
Playlist.
Yeah, it's not like Drake where you can just listen to one, song,
Yeah.
But that actually might legitimately happen. But in that case, again, Pitchfork is in a weird place because they still do album reviews. They still really privilege the album. They still rank albums. Their biggest list is the album's list. And they still do stuff like, I was going to mention this earlier. They still do stuff like Casey Musgraves. They'll say they go this auteur theory route. In their review, they make this big argument like, she is brilliant. She wrote all this stuff. She really, she really like crafted this sound to create this certain mood. Or like Beyonce, they'll be like, she is like this true auteur. Like she totally designed this whole thing. And then you'll be like, well, Nina Simone was barely present for like 4 of the songs on her album. And they'll be like, well, that doesn't matter. That's very rockist of you to care that she didn't like write or even play on any,
yeah, they're not consistent.
So they still have these biases and they're very inconsistent with the way they apply them, I think is another problem. So I don't know if you guys want to add anything. Is there any way to sum this up? Did we figure it out? What ruined Pitchfork?
I don't think we figured it out. I don't know if I think we did.
But we have to agree it's bad, right? We have to agree that it's bad.
It's at least past its prime. Yeah. I think you have to.
Ryan Schreiber jumping ship is a very bad sign.
I think the purchase, obviously it was a major deal. The idea that this mass media corporation came in, probably like I mentioned with like their statistics and their numbers game, wanting to make sure that they could do whatever they could to build revenue, and the thing that you lose with that obviously is a lot of authenticity, right? So
looking back, I feel like they'll say that the Condé Nast purchase was the sort of end of Pitchfork. I feel pretty confident about that.
But saying that, if Condé Nast would like to purchase this podcast for $50 million,
certainly
it is for sale.
Certainly.
Next week we'll be discussing.
God, did you guys hear that new Casey Musgraves record? It was was great.
Oh, it's great.
I loved it.
I loved Infinity War.
All right. Well, I think that's enough time for this week. The first podcast in the can, as they say in the biz. So tell us what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts. We maybe can read something on the air. Email us popshieldpod@gmail.com. That's popshieldpod@gmail.com. We're going to do one episode every 2 weeks, so we'll see you in 2 weeks from now. If you like the show, help us out by subscribing. Leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and stay connected on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all that junk. It's at popshieldpod, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.
So long.